Good evening, everyone. I'm Alice Kunyupi-Clifton, one of the directors of Community United West Berkshire. Firstly, thank you very much for registering for this amazing and challenging awareness event. Defeat unconscious bias. The objective of this event is to increase awareness about unconscious bias and how we can tackle this hidden bias. Just to say that, we all have attended Zoom events and we sort of know the etiquette, but I'm just going to reinforce what we need and need not do. When you first join in, you'll automatically be muted. Although you can unmute yourself at any point, we kindly ask not to do so unless prompted, as this can cause echo for other participants. We will also ask you to disable your video during the presentation, as it takes up a lot of the bandwidth and will cause issues for those who do not have very high speed internet. There will, however, be opportunities for you to feedback and ask questions. To ask questions, we ask you to use the chat box and message. We will then be able to see your questions and pass it on to the presenters. Using Zoom hands up feature will also help us to see whether you would like, and we will ask you to participate. Next, when you do this, we will also be able to see and unmute you to let you speak. Please remember to put your hand down once you have spoken by clicking on the icon again. And once again, just to say, I hope you have a fantastic experience with us as we move into this event online. Carol, your turn.
Thank you, Alice. Welcome, everybody. And tonight we have three eminent speakers to engaging with us on the subject of unconscious bias and how to defeat it. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Belinda von Zyl. Belinda is a social worker, associate lecturer, mentor and coach. She's passionate about creating social change by breaking down barriers, and this has led to a very personal journey of learning. Belinda was born in South Africa during the apartheid era, with the apartheid system being a socialite construct promoting white privilege. Naturally, Belinda's formative years have influenced her interest in understanding how bias and unconscious bias is constructed and how this impacts relationships, decision-making and workplace practices. Currently, Belinda is undertaking a PhD at Oxford Brookes Business School with her research interest in workplace mentoring. She continues to work as an associate lecturer, but also supports several local authorities, charities, and a hospice in her spare time. Belinda volunteers for Cruz Bereavement Services, being particularly interested in considering how bereavement support can meet the needs of diverse communities when grief and loss occur. Welcome, Belinda.
Thank you so much, Carol. Let me just quickly make sure that I can share my screen, because I've got some slides here and I just need to make sure that they are working okay. Right, hoping that you can all see that. Yeah, can you all see that? If I can get a thumbs up from somebody, that would be great.
Yeah. All good.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Okay, Carol, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Community United's team for hosting this event, because it's quite a contentious subject that we're talking about. Obviously something that's close to my heart, and the fact that we've got so many people listening to this, I'm sure it's close to your heart as well. Please be aware, this is just a tiny little flavour of sort of unconscious bias. There is, people write thesis and PhD dissertations and things like that on this. So it's a tiny little glimpse of my experience with regards to unconscious bias. So I thought I might just pose a question to you first before I start talking. I wonder what thoughts went through your mind when I was being introduced. Were you consciously aware of what those thoughts were? Were you making some sort of evaluation about me? Maybe my skin color caused you to believe something about me. Maybe my unusual surname, that could have made you wonder about my origins. Maybe my accent caused you to falter, or maybe my age got you to start believing something about me. You see, these are all assumptions. These are all biases that we create as we evaluate people, and often they are hidden. And they're not only connected to race, they're connected to difference. And we are connected to our need to feel safe through the connections that we have with people like us. And those that are unfamiliar to us, we may unwittingly hold a bias towards them. And they may present as being unconscious. So where does bias come from? So one of the ideas is that it is socially constructed. It is constructed through things like political systems and structures, cultures, values, beliefs, societal structures, educational structures, religious ideologies, family practices. And I have a tiny little wheel on the right-hand side that looks at the concept of power and privilege, and how power sometimes is underneath all these structures, and how these structures can start discriminating. Now, there's about 40 years of research that's starting to look at where does prejudice, discrimination, even hatred towards somebody come from. And initially they thought that it was an individual identity that we would potentially hold. But what research is telling us is that it's people's social identity that creates these phenomena. And it gives us an understanding of how we treat and engage with people. And it depends on how we treat and engage with people, depends on the degree to which we see those people sharing a particular social identity with us. Okay, so that's kind of a key point that I just wanted to make. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist. I wish I was, actually. I would then probably really understand how our brain functions when it comes to decision making, and how we filter information, how we store information, how we process that information. But what I do know is that we are constantly filtering through information, and it's almost like our first form of defense. We are constantly looking at the world, and we are filtering through whether we need to be fearful or have a threat response towards something. And unfortunately, some of those decisions that we make are based on subjective reality. There isn't an objective truth to what we believe and how we respond and how we react. And that can become particularly difficult when we are making decisions about somebody or towards somebody. So why is it harmful? Well, as I said, unconscious bias initially, or bias, is an early detection service, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what does become difficult and challenging is when our bias, our assumptions, impact other people. So they might marginalize people, they might label or stigmatize people, and to the worst extent, what it can do is start dehumanizing people. Now, we may think that we live in a world that doesn't dehumanize, and I'm going to say to you that reality check, there are still parts, there's still people, there's still groups of people that do dehumanize other people. And it does happen in our life course. And in fact, it's happened in my life course, growing up in South Africa under apartheid system. And I hope you'll just bear with me, because I just want to give you a little taste of my experience growing up in a white apartheid South Africa, where white power and white privilege was endorsed through different structures. So it was endorsed through political systems, educational systems, medical systems, and social systems. We had social segregation. So if you think about this, I was a child of the 70s, so it's not that long ago. Well, for some people it's quite long ago, but it's not hugely long ago. And if you think apartheid actually only finished, or really kind of was challenged and sort of disbanded, was around sort of the early 90s. So it was quite recently in some respects. But as I grew up as a child, I was socially sort of constructed or conditioned, socially conditioned to believe that as a white person, I had supremacy over any other person of color. That was what I grew up with, and you don't question that. And so these are some of the pictures that I grew up with. So you would see that there were beaches that were segregated. So there was a beach for a white person, there was a beach for somebody of color. Trains, buses, there was segregation. There was segregation in public toilets. There was segregation in shops, in benches. You couldn't stand or sit in a place where somebody else that wasn't of your color functioned. So can you see, as a little girl growing up in that sort of culture that endorses white power and white privilege, the impact that that has on society? There is a quote that Paul Quivel has spoken about, and unfortunately I can't read it because there's a whole lot of pictures that are covering it. But what the basic premise of this is the fact that if there is a group that dominates because of power, they become the cultural center of that society, and everybody else is on the peripheral. And that certainly was happening in South Africa. So how did a child of the 70s growing up in that ended up questioning inequality? Well, research has spoken about the fact that sometimes we only stop and question something when we've got a disorientating dilemma. So something disorientates us, stops us in our tracks, and makes us think, what if I always believe that maybe is not true? Now, this disorientating dilemma actually occurred when I was really little. I was about 8 or 9 years old. It's where your moral and social kind of development starts happening in a child's, particularly your moral development, not your social, your moral development. And it happened, it was really interesting. So I'm part of a dominant culture. I'm part of a culture of power. I'm moving through my daily life, my daily routine. I'm not aware the impact of my power and my privilege has on anybody. I don't question it. That's part of the society I'm growing up with. But this picture is very significant to me. So this is a picture of Kalk Bay Harbour, Kalk Bay Beach in Cape Town. And this beach was, I was walking along a sort of a wall, sort of looking over into this beach with my parents and my sister. And all I wanted to do as this child, I wanted to go down and play on the beach with the other children. And I was sort of urging my father to take me down to this little inlet, this little beach, the one that you see before you. And he stopped me, he pulled me, and he pointed to the sign. You'll see the sign on the right-hand side. It was a sign that was similar to that. And he said to me, Belinda, you cannot go down there because you've got a white skin. You cannot go onto that beach. That beach is for people of color. You have to go to a beach that's a little bit further down. And I remember feeling quite angry about that. Why wasn't I not allowed to be down on the beach because of the color of my skin? It just didn't make sense to me as a child. And I think my dad, I mean, I still remember the conversation. It's kind of, it takes me straight back to that because it was really a challenge to me. My dad is a very strong man of faith, and he turned to me and he said to me, Belinda, do you believe that God created sort of segregation? He said that in a very simplistic way. He said, when you get to heaven one day, do you think there'll be a heaven for a white person and a heaven for a black person? Do you think that God has created one person that has more power than the other person? And he started opening my eyes. And this took a few years as he developed that and made me question all the time about my white supremacy. And it had a significant impact on me. It really led me to question a huge amount of what I had grown up to believe was true. And it has led me to a life journey, I guess, and I'm still on that journey. I need to tell you that I still know that I hold unconscious bias. It is still the journey that I am constantly walking on. But I am very pleased to have been part of that journey because it started to make me think about structures and systems. Now, you might say to me, but hold on, Belinda, that was overtly racism. You were part of that system. That's not British system. That's not what we've experienced. This doesn't happen in Britain. I'm going to tell you it does. If you're part of a dominant culture, you're moving through your daily lives, you're not actually aware of your power and privilege. You need to really think about your medical systems, how those medical systems have been structured and built, education systems. Think about some of your organizations as well. There's been a recent report, 2018, looking at British organizations and whether they're still built on imperialistic ideologies. I have actually put the text down if you want to read the article. I think it's a very interesting article, and if you're interested, the article is at the end of this PowerPoint. I'm just going to end off now by asking you to have a little look at a picture I'm going to show you. And I wonder, you can write in the chat box if you want, what do you first see when I show you this picture? Okay. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to wonder whether you see something different now that you've got a closer look. Now you might be saying to me, why? What has this got to do with unconscious bias? All I'm trying to say is sometimes we initially only see the world through our lens. And if we step back and if we move aside and look at somebody else's lens, we might unravel and might uncover a few nuances. So if I go back, you had one picture. As you move forward, you get to see the minutiae, the kind of little parts of that picture in a much more full capacity. And that's what happens when our unconscious bias comes to light. We start looking at the world, looking at the pictures we created slightly differently. This quote comes from a woman called Marianne Williamson. She's an activist, and I just want to end with it because I thought it was a really positive quote. She says, "Love is what we're born with. Fear is what we learn. The spiritual journey is the unlearning of fear and prejudices and the acceptance of love back in our hearts. Love is the essential reality and our purpose on earth. To be consciously aware of it, to experience love in ourselves and others is the meaning of life. Meaning does not lie in things, meaning lies in us." Okay. Just to quickly tell you, you probably can have access to these PowerPoints if you contact Community United, but just to kind of just point you out, I could have put loads of stuff. I get really excited when I find interesting links, but the first link is just something that looks at social phenomenon and how that is constructed and biases are constructed. The second one I would point you to, I think it's quite a good site to go and have a look at, Fighting Hate for Good. You can actually do this little online sort of unconscious bias behavior type of questionnaire. The last one is the article that I spoke to you about that was produced in 2018 about imperialistic Britain and how structures potentially are still sort of inculcated in our system and how that impacts particularly sort of minority groups. These are books. You'll see the first two books are from Judy Wright. She's one of our speakers. The White Privilege Unmasked is great. I would recommend a good read. All of these books I personally have found great value in. Coaching for Transformation, if you're in organizations, I'll point you to that book, but also there's a number of other books that have supported kind of looking at sort of how do we coach a workforce to greater diversity, better acceptance, better understanding of ourselves. This is what I'm passionate about, is coaching for transformation, coaching for emancipation, coaching for voice. The last one is a racial encounter. It's really interesting. It's about Professor Kevin Durham from Natal University in South Africa. He looks at social constructivism. He looks at social identities and also looking at sort of categorization theory as well. And he looked at sort of how the apartheid system changed from segregated society to a desegregated society and the impact on that. So if you have any interest in that, that's a book that would be useful. So it's a whistle-stop tour. I'm sorry if I spoke too fast. I was trying to keep it down to kind of like a minimum time. If you want to get hold of me, my email is there. I'm happy to hear stories. I'm happy to have a dialogue with you. Yeah, so back to Carol, in case there is any questions and if we've got time. Otherwise, I know we might have to move on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Belinda. That was fantastic. I'd really like to open the floor to any questions, because it's an opportunity for people to engage. Julian, you got any questions?
Well, thank you. And thank you to Belinda. That was a very powerful presentation, and I hope everybody found it as engaging as I did. We've had a lot of comments in the chat, but I'm not sure there's any particular questions. We've got a question from Douglas Finley. He says, if the bias is truly unconscious, how do we recognize it without others pointing it out? If unconscious bias needs to be pointed out, how is that done in a hierarchical or segregated system without negative consequences?
Yeah, it's a challenge. That's a challenging question, because yes, how do we unravel something that we're not aware of? And as I said earlier, often sort of transformation occurs when we have had a disorientating dilemma, and often that is when something has been pointed out or if something's personally impacted us. I wonder whether Judy might end up sort of talking about that, or maybe Wally might as well. I don't know, but it might, if we don't sufficiently kind of cover it now, we could maybe talk about it later. But I don't want to kind of go over something that somebody else might be talking about.
No, indeed. Well, we do have some time set aside at the end for a general Q&A. It was intended that this was just a slot for any questions directly related to your presentation, but nobody else has come forward with anything. So shall we carry all the other comments forward to the Q&A at the end? I think that would be the best thing to do. Carol.
Thank you. Our second speaker I'd like to introduce is Wally Ryman. Wally is an organisational development consultant specialising in inclusion and diversity at Wiltshire Council. He's also the co-chair of the Black Minority Ethnic Staff Network. Wally has a Chartered Management Institute Level 3 diploma in Leadership and Management and an Institute of Leadership and Management certificate in unconscious bias. Welcome, Wally.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an honour and pleasure to be with you all this evening. I'll just share my screen so you can see my slides. Okay, so should be able to see that now. Right, so I'm going to talk to you today about the impacts of unconscious bias on individuals and the workforce. So what we're going to look at is, first of all, the impact of bias and how these biases affect individuals, the reality of the workplace and what the data tells us. We're also just going to touch on the gender pay gap, talk about names and identity, and we're going to look at the impact of bias on the economy. And finally, we will discuss how we can mitigate bias. So just like the previous speaker, who actually has given me a very hard act to follow, it's a brilliant presentation, it will be a whistle-stop tour, and I'll tell you at the end where you can get further information. So, right, just to begin with, I want to define what unconscious bias is. And I know our previous speaker kindly did elaborate on that. but I just want to share with you quickly so we know we're all on the same page. So unconscious biases are our unintended people preferences formed by our socialization and experiences, including exposure to the media. So although our socialization and our society and culture, upbringing, all of that plays a part, I personally feel that the media does have a really strong role to play in that. Unconscious biases are the result of our limited cognitive capacity. We implicitly and automatically both group and categorize people to avoid having to conduct completely new assessments for every new person. So in the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Professor Daniel Kahneman, he talks about two systems of thinking in the human brain, which is thinking fast and slow. And what this means is that most of our actions, they are unconscious, they're intuitive and fast, while the more important decisions that we need to make are based on slow thinking. And again, we don't have much time to go into that, but just linked to that, I just want to mention that we unconsciously assign positive and negative value to the categories that we use. So in society, as well as sort of what we get from the media, from our upbringing, and even from around us, what happens is we start to create patterns. So, and they are to do with prejudices, biases, and so on. And this can affect how we see people in certain roles in society, whether it's male or female, black or white, and so on. So psychologists say what the brain fires together, it wires together. So for example, if I'm a traveling salesman and I'm going around the country knocking on the doors of different businesses, and every time I approach a business, I'm greeted at reception by a female receptionist, then sooner or later my brain is going to make that connection between female and receptionist. And it's going to take those connections as the norm. And whenever I come across a male receptionist, it's going to say that that's the exception, and it's not going to categorize that male with the general category of receptionists. So I just want you to think for a second. Let's just do a mindfulness exercise, if you like. So I know these last 9 months have been tough for everyone. We've been stuck in, working from home, not getting out much, not seeing our friends and families. So finally, we've had some good news, haven't we, today, that there's a vaccine on the way. So we've managed to book ourselves the holiday of a lifetime. And after the year we've had, boy, do we deserve it. So we're now sitting on a plane where, you know, on the runway, we put our baggage, you know, we put our hand luggage up on the shelf above our seats. We're just flicking through the in-flight magazines. We're ordering our drinks, talking to our partner or children. And then we're just thinking about the final destination, about the beach and the hotel that we're going to arrive at pretty soon. And then there's an announcement on the radio, on the airplane, and it's the captain. And the captain is telling us about the, you know, temperature outside, the conditions, the flight conditions, and so on, how long the journey is going to be, and all of that. And the captain is very friendly, very talkative, and putting us at ease. I want you to now think about the captain. Think about what the captain looks like. Okay, I'm just going to put a poll up. If I can ask Rob to kindly put the poll up for you all. Now, can you tell me, honestly, what was the gender of the captain that you imagined? Okay, so yeah, there you go. So it's no shock that the overwhelming response has been male. And so I hope that can show you how, how ingrained these biases are, these patterns that we create, that society creates for us. Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. So what are the impacts of, or what is the impact, sorry, of unconscious bias? So biases affect who we listen to and whose opinions we value. It's especially true in the workplace. Who we recruit. And they say that managers often hire in their own image. They also impact on how we attribute behavior, as we mentioned, how we allocate work and provide feedback in the workplace, and how we provide informal support, coaching, mentoring, and sponsorship. And this is a really important and overlooked aspect of one's career. In fact, JP Morgan Chase & Co. say that the number one factor in anyone's success is whether or not you've got a senior sponsor who's vested in your success and can show you the ropes. And a lot of the times, these sponsors choose the people they are going to nurture for the future based on their affinity and the biases that they have. Now, affinity bias, which is it's not there's nothing wrong with it in and of itself. However, if we are choosing people in the organization for promotion and so on based on whether we like them or not, then that's a serious issue. But unfortunately, they say a lot of important promotion decisions and so on are made on the golf course or down the pub. But we have to try and challenge that and change that for the better of our organizations and our workforce. And it's all about who gets heard and who doesn't. So these biases that are created, they create insider and outsider dynamics within organizations. So it's the insiders who set the norms. They're the privileged ones. They benefit from bias, while the outsiders, they have to fit in, and they're very aware of their group identity, and they're negatively impacted by unconscious bias. Also, what can happen in organizations is that if we let these biases creep in and take over, then we have echo chambers where information, ideas, and beliefs which are shared, they get amplified. So the majority views are the ones that get amplified and get heard and repeated, while other views are suppressed or not given any airtime. And what does that lead to? It just leads to an organization full of clones. And as we know that, that doesn't serve the organization well at all. So I just want to give you a few headlines from a recent report that was conducted by Sky News, and the link is in the slides, so the slides will be shared with you afterwards. But just a few highlights from that. So they found that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people hold just 4.6% of the top workplace roles in the UK, despite being 14% of the population. Women, who are 51% of the overall population, only make up 26% of the top positions in the workplace. And BAME women make up even less, so 1% of the top positions, while they account for 7% of the population. And that's the link to that study. And also, this is just a look at racial bias by sector. So this is taken from data from the Harvard Implicit Association Test, which is an online test that is free and it's available. If I'll share those in the chat later on, but anyone can go on that and you can do a test to see how biased you are with regards to race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. It's not perfect, but it does give you some idea, and if anything, it's worth having that information for yourself and possibly taking that 2 or 3 times just for consistency. But here we can see that the most biased sectors are academia and legal and financial, and also construction. And also a quick look at the gender pay gap then. So the gender pay gap came into effect 2 or 3 years ago, and is compulsory on all organizations who employ over 250 staff to report their gender pay gap, and is taken by looking at the lowest paid male and the highest paid male, and then looking at the median score, and then doing the same for the lowest paid female and the highest paid female, and then comparing the median scores between the males and the females. So this is something which has been really insightful for us as a country, because it shows us where that balance lies. And at the moment, the UK is the gender pay gap is around 18%, and some organisations are doing much better. Some organisations are doing worse. So it's public knowledge. So I hope no one will mind me sharing this. But well, I'll just say there's an airline company, surprise, surprise, that is performing the worst according to the data at the moment, and their gender pay gap is around 75%. So that's the difference between the median male and the female, or rather female and male earnings. Also, we find that there's a lot of discrimination in terms of shortlisting. So especially when it comes to male and female ethnicities and so on. David Cameron said in 2015, "Do you know that in our country today, even if they have exactly the same qualifications, people with white sounding names are nearly twice as likely to get callbacks for jobs than people with ethnic sounding names." And credit to David Cameron, he actually, as a result of realizing this, he changed the application process to the civil service that same year and introduced blind shortlisting. So that's something that organizations can do to address that imbalance. And I'm conscious of time, but what is quite insightful as well, if not shocking, is that because of the bias that takes place, and according to another research that was commissioned by Theresa May in 2017, the impact on the economy due to bias and discrimination is that we are losing as a country £24 billion a year because of this bias and discrimination. And I'd urge anyone to read at least the summary of the McGregor-Smith review to look into that a bit more detail. But we all know the benefits of diversity and why we need to address bias. If nothing else, addressing bias and promoting diversity will lead to better profitability and productivity for organizations. And those are just some statistics from McKinsey & Company, the world's largest consulting firm. So they say that the companies with the more ethnic diversity in their executive teams are more profitable by 35%. And those companies with executive teams that are more gender diverse are more profitable by 16%. So that just shows you. So these are just some of the reasons why we need to address bias. There's a legal case, performance and financial we just mentioned. And if nothing else, we have a moral obligation to ensure our recruitment processes are fair and ethical. And finally, I just want to show you how we can address and promote inclusion in the workplace, how we can address bias. So this model, the link is there. You can have a look at that in more detail, but it's called the Space 2 model of mindful inclusion. So first of all, we need to slow down our thinking. We have to create empathy and take part in perspective taking. We have to ask ourselves and challenge our assumptions. We have to use cultural intelligence. We have to look for exemplars, identify counter-stereotypical individuals, because there's good and bad in every society, every culture, every group of people. So we have to look for those individuals that counter the stereotype narrative. And finally, we have to expand our networks, even our friendships and our work connections and contacts, and be diverse not only in our thinking, but in what we read, what we see, what we watch, the people we talk to and hang out with, and so on. And so, as I mentioned, that was a whistle-stop tour. I hope that was beneficial. Just want to end off with just a slight plug, if I may. So I deliver training on unconscious bias. So it's a 2.5-hour course. So if you want to benefit from that, then please do get in touch at the email address there. So thank you all for listening to me, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Wally. That was another very engaging presentation. There have been a few comments in the chat, which I'm sure others will have seen as they go through, which may be points or questions you might like to address. One from Cassia, who posted after having answered your poll. She posted that she said she was so disappointed with herself, and I wonder, I'm sure there must have been others who would have reacted in the same way. I wonder if you have any thoughts you could share on that.
Well, first of all, I mean, there's no need to be disappointed in yourself, because, as I mentioned, it's something that is hardwired. So being biased is part of who we are. And there was actually something from the UN that said that even by the age of 6, girls already think about males as being more suited to clever and intelligent roles, job roles, and so on. So it's nothing that we need to be ashamed of. It's just, I think, as a society, as teachers, as educators, as parents, we just need to make sure that we try and counter that. And again, as I mentioned, it's all to do with what we see as well, the patterns that we see around us. So it goes to show that when we look around, on our travels, we do see that. So that's why it's lodged in our brains. But hopefully, we can only improve that by encouraging and empowering women in those roles.
Thank you for that. And there's a question from Ian, which is in relation to some of the statistics that you posted in the latter part of your presentation, Wally. He says, are there correlations between businesses and industry sectors with high bias around gender and those with bias around race or sexuality?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, but I can try and find out. So I've only so far looked at the race bias, because that seems to be the most obvious. But I'm sure there is data around gender biases. Actually, sorry. So there is something, I didn't put it in the presentation, but one of the findings was that 75% of those people taking the test actually associated men with work roles and women with sort of looking after the home. So that is one statistic I can share.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Several people have raised the issue around the use of the acronym BAME, and I know we talked about that our last event, and I suspect it's probably something best left as a discussion point for the end of the session. I just thought I'd mention that just so people are aware that I've picked that up, and we're certainly not ignoring it. Just maybe think it might be better addressed to all of you rather than just to Wally, if that's okay. And finally, the Harvard implicit association test that you mentioned, Wally, is just to be clear, is that something that we can all find online and
Yes.
take?
Yeah, I'll what I'll do is I'll put the link in my slides, and then when you send that out, then people can have that.
That would be fabulous. That's great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Carol.
Thank you. Thank you, Wally. That was very, very informative. And there's a lot of tips and tricks that we can all take on board to work a bit more on our unconscious bias. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our final speaker today is Judy Ride, PhD. Judy is a co-founder of the Bath Centre for Psychotherapy and Counselling and the Centre for Supervision, Training and Development. She is a UKCP accredited psychotherapist and works as a psychotherapist, supervisor and trainer. She is a director and supervisor of the Trauma Foundation Southwest, which provides counselling and psychotherapy for refugees and asylum seekers. Judy's doctoral research was into whiteness within psychotherapy and psychotherapy organisations at the University of Bath. Being White in Helping Professionals was subsequently published in 2009, and her book, White Privilege Unmasked, which was referred to earlier, How to Be Part of the Solution, was published in April 2019. Judy is co-author with Peter Hawkins of the book Integrative Psychotherapy in Therapy and Practice. A rational, systemic and ecological approach was published in October 2019. Thank you, Judy.
And you're muted, Judy. We can't hear you. And
Sorry.
now you're not. That's okay. We can hear you now.
Yes. Thank you very much for that, Carol. And what two fantastic presentations we've had. Very different to each other, and I hope mine will be different as well. I think, although they're very different, I would certainly go along with all of them, with both of them. So here are my slides. So I'm going to start by asking the question, what do we mean by unconscious when we talk about unconscious bias? I noticed in the chat that somebody was saying, well, how can we know about it if it's unconscious? By definition, we won't know about it. And I think that's a really good observation. Because if something's unconscious, it's not available to our conscious mind. So I've picked out two ways of looking at the unconscious, and I'm sure there are more, and I think more have been mentioned already. Freud talked about the unconscious as being some material that's been repressed, things that that are too painful to be aware of. So you kind of push it down, you repress the knowledge of something. But how I think of it is that the unconscious is also something that's held within the way we structure our way of understanding the world. And I think the other two speakers have been saying something similar to that. So it's not so much what we think, but how we think. So, for instance, some cultures may be very dualistic in their thinking, and that's already been mentioned as well. That if something is not good, it's bad. So there's nothing in between, if you like. So that if we think of something as good, that's what it is, and if it's not good, it's bad. So that might be how we think rather than what we think. So we might think that, I don't know, what can I say? Well, say we say black people are good, white people are bad, or the other way around. So is our bias held in our repressed unconscious? If we find something about that too difficult, too painful to think about, then we might repress the knowledge of it. We might not want to think of ourselves, for instance, as racist, and we repress any knowledge of that. I'll come back to that a bit later. So is our bias held in the culture? And very often it is. And this can include deeply held historical attitudes. The history of white people is pretty shocking in terms of being racist. And we know that there's been colonization, which has led to slavery, and the terrible ways in which slaves were treated like animals, were bought and sold. And sometimes people can say, well, that's got nothing to do with us now. That's all in the past. We wouldn't do that kind of thing now. So it has no relevance to our present day attitudes. But actually, if we look at it more deeply, the historical history actually does inform how we think now. And we are still benefiting by what we gained historically over donkey's years ago. We are still benefiting by as white people. So so history can influence our attitudes in the present day. And as we've been hearing already, cultural attitudes are passed on in childhood, that we get attitudes come to us through our parents' attitudes, what they say to us, like girls should wear pink and boys should wear blue, for instance. And that's passed on, not in so many words. Our parents may not say to us, in fact, they might even say the opposite. Why not wear blue if you're a girl? But somehow this is passed on subliminally. So we don't, because we don't see it in so many words, it's all the more powerful. And we can pick up from our parents a fear of what is strange or different. We look to our parents to actually see how they respond to things that they find in the world, and we pick up these attitudes in a way that becomes unconscious, that's sort of structured into who we are, rather than necessarily something we're thinking of in a more overt way. And of course, also, we may fear losing what our normal, taken for granted privileges are. We may think that we don't want our privileges, but actually, would we really like to lose them? So these things are sort of held subliminally in our in our unconscious. But is there anything we can do about it? I think we're not completely at the mercy of our unconscious. So this is what's addressing that question. We can go through the pain of allowing ourselves to recognize our unconscious bias. That means really facing head on something. Probably somebody else was saying, we need somebody to show it to us. If we are shown it, that our bias, do we defend against that and say, well, that couldn't possibly be the case because I'm a good person, I couldn't possibly think that? Or can we actually look at it in the face, allow that there's a possibility of our racism and our unconscious bias? We can study our history, for example, and really face the truth of our history, rather than say, oh, well, that's just happened in the past and it's got nothing to do with how we are now. And then there's something I often suggest when I'm running a workshop or something about this sort of thing, that whether you can actually catch thoughts that you've had. It's a bit like the thing about the captain being male. We, particularly when it comes to racism, we don't like to have these sorts of ideas in our minds. So, for instance, if you are walking along the street in the dark and you see a black person, we might not like to think that we're frightened of them, for instance. Why should the black person be any more frightening than a white person? But if we really stop and think, or we sort of catch on to what we're thinking, we might find that we had that thought, this person is dangerous because they're black. And I encourage people to actually catch those thoughts, so that they become more aware of the racism and the bias that they hold. And it's quite painful and difficult to do that, partly because they go through our mind so quickly, they kind of come in and out almost instantaneously. But if we catch them, we can become more aware of our own biases, even if they're difficult things to actually realize that we think. So recognizing our unconscious bias and not just dismissing it is one way we can, or is maybe the main way that we can become held by those things that are structured into us. We can loosen the structures around us so that becoming aware of them is half the battle. That was the last one. So yeah, I'd be very interested to know what people think about that, and whether you can catch those sorts of thoughts that you have as they enter your mind and enter them and exit them really quickly. Yeah. And you may be interested that I have blogs on white privilege in my my website, and I've just written one on unconscious bias because of doing this. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. That's, again, a very insightful presentation, and I hope everybody else found it the same. There have been a few comments and questions which maybe you could comment on. Thanda Malanga, I hope I've got that right, says, I don't like the term unconscious bias because it lets people off the hook. It says you are, but you're not aware of it. And in the same vein, related, I think, Aidan Ferguson says, once we've realized that we have bias, how do we remove it?
Yeah, I know what you mean about the not liking the term unconscious bias because it lets us off the hook. I think it once we realize that unconscious bias is a thing, I think it behoves us to try to understand our own biases and bring them into consciousness, as it were. But I think biases are often unconscious, but that doesn't mean to say we can't do anything about it. And what was the other thing? It was a bit
once we've realized that we have a bias, how do we remove it?
How do we, yeah. Well, I think the first thing to do is to realize it's there. And then, as Wally was saying, you know, we can challenge ourselves about these things. And for instance, if we notice we don't have any friends who are Black, why is that? Can we make friends with Black people? What's that like? What would stop us doing it, for instance? And just, you know, uncovering more and more of what there is there. And I think when you do that, actually things do begin to change. In my book, I've got a what I call the white awareness model, which shows a process that you can go through to become more white aware, for instance. You know,
okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Wally, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, thank you very much. Can I just add to that, basically, what I should have said in my presentation. So, as you rightly said, Judy, the first step is to acknowledge that we have biases, and it's something that we all have. So it's part of human nature. But in the context of the workplace and business, we have to ask ourselves, when we make a decision, do we act on those biases? So that's the key here, whether we act on those biases. And we have to slow down our thinking and make sure that decisions, especially those affecting other people, when it comes to hiring and firing and so on, and especially where, you know, when we're talking about in other services like the police force, for example, whether those biases creep into our service that we deliver and the people that we serve. So that's the key there.
Okay, thank you. Belinda, did you want to comment on that at all? You don't have to if you've got anything to add, but just to try and be open about it. So, well, can I suggest we just go back to the question of the acronym BAME, because I know that's probably not directly related to the topic this evening, but it is something that we discussed at the last event we had, and it's come up again as an important issue. And with that in mind, we've got Maria Sidawi saying, what is a better way to refer to those from underrepresented backgrounds, as she really dislikes the acronym BAME. And Bhagava says BAME staff do not like being categorized as BAME, so how best to approach that? Wally, perhaps I could put that back to you to start with.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, but I think it's one of those issues that sidetracks us from the objective. So, you know, we're debating about terminology, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. And we're trying to improve the working conditions and lives of people. So from that point of view, that is something that exists. You know, it helps us to identify patterns and issues and so on. I do see that it's not sort of encompassing, because, yeah, when you say BAME, we're not a homogenous group. So, you know, within the BAME category, there are lots of differences, you know, within each ethnic group. So in that sense, yes, it doesn't do a good job, but I think it's the best that we have at the moment. But ideally, yeah, we need to see further breakdowns. But when we're talking about addressing inequalities, for the time being at least, I think it's the best thing we've got.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Judy, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I would absolutely agree with Wally. It isn't nice to lump people all together. I think that's can be felt as disrespectful, and I think where possible, it's probably better to be more specific. Like somebody comes from, I don't know, Iraq or Botswana, to say this person comes from Botswana rather than he's a BAME person. But as Wally says, I mean, sometimes these shorthands are kind of useful.
Thank you. Belinda, is there anything you want to add? Again, you don't feel you have to, but if you want to contribute.
Well, I mean, I am aware that this issue has been brought up because we've had these discussions in the past, and I think it's really important to break open discussions and also think, where did that originate from? Where did that sort of acronym originate? Who originated it? And are people happy to be labelled from a generic term? I think that's really important. I think the work that I do in terms of mentoring, my colleagues would actually say that they would not want to be called or labelled or lumped in a category that is, as Wally pointed out, a homogeneous category. And I've recently had the most bizarre experience as well. And it's down to labelling and whether you identify with that label. We are kind of suggesting that people need to identify with a label. My son got onto a particular program because his parents are immigrants. I was labelled an immigrant, and I reeled back thinking, an immigrant, somebody's labelled me an immigrant. What does that actually mean? How am I actually identifying with that label? So I think it's important just to think about what labels do and how they created a sort of social identity and whether people are happy with that social identity. And yeah, as Wally said, at the moment there isn't another way of defining, but maybe that's something that we need to be thinking about. We need to be breaking these conversations open.
Do you think it's the case then that using a term like BAME does engender a certain unconscious bias response in the people both using it and the people hearing it?
I personally believe it does, but maybe Wally and Judy might have different views.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah, I think it certainly could. Yeah.
I mean, it labels and it defines, and it also creates. What worries me is about a number of research talks about when we take on a label, how does that psychologically impact us? How do we then start almost oppressing ourselves as we step into that label? So yeah, I'm at the moment unraveling the label of an immigrant, and what does that mean and how does that define me? So again, that's a bit of a disorientating dilemma for me. I've never been called an immigrant. I felt like an outsider. I felt like I don't belong. So if that's how I'm feeling, I'm starting to wonder, how are other people feeling with labels?
Labels, I think, are an issue. As Alice Brown has pointed out, they're a way of othering people from centrist views. The same for the LGBTQI plus communities and in so many different groups. I mean, obviously our main interest here this evening is identity and labelling around ethnicity, but there are many other ways in which labelling can affect people, as others have pointed out. So if we could perhaps just get back to the main topic of this evening, which is unconscious bias. We have a question from Elizabeth Capewell, who says, given that racism is unconscious, how would you go about convincing people, and especially institutions, who believe that they're not racist, that this is actually a subject that they need to address? And are you able to give any specific examples that have worked? Wally, perhaps given your particular involvement, that might be one to put to you first.
No, that's a good question. I think we have to differentiate between unconscious bias and racism and discrimination, because even when you talk about unconscious bias, there's also conscious bias, which basically is racism. So when we talk about unconscious bias, we're talking about those biases that are deep-rooted, and they're not necessarily racist, if that makes sense. Whereas racism is overt, it's with intent. So when people, for example, if somebody, shouted a slur at me in the street, I wouldn't consider that as being an unconscious bias that they have. That's out and out racism. Whereas if I were to not be shortlisted for a job that I applied for, despite having the qualifications, and somebody else with less qualifications, or even the same qualifications as me, who had an English sounding name, was shortlisted, then that I would see as an unconscious bias on the part of the hiring manager. So yeah, just to make the differentiation between those two things.
Okay, so accepting that racism is, as you just defined it, if I'm right, Wally, is a conscious bias.
Yeah.
But the question was really, I guess, aimed at convincing both people and institutions who believe that they are not racist that this is a subject they need to address. Sorry, Judy, can we just...
I was saying I have a bit of a slightly different perspective on it from Wally.
Okay.
Yeah, nice to hear Elizabeth Capewell, who I happen to know. Just to say that I think racism can be conscious, and it can be unconscious as well. And I think that's what Elizabeth's pointing to, that people can deny that they're racist because they actually don't realise that they are. Or they don't actually count what they do as racist. Like if they think, I mean, the example of not shortlisting people with foreign sounding names could be an example of that. They may not realise that that's what they've done, but if they looked back over their recruitment policy, they might actually see that and think, oh my goodness, that's true. We haven't ever interviewed people with foreign sounding names or something like that. They might not actually realize. And that, I would say that was unconscious racism. I mean, it could be conscious, of course. They could be thinking, oh goodness, we don't want someone like that coming into our organization, but often it's not necessarily conscious. I suppose another thing is that if you are going to point this out to people, they're probably more likely to accept it if you show it to them in a way that's not very attacking to begin with. You kind of say, well, we all have, like Wally's saying, we all have these sort of biases, and let's just have a look at what yours are.
Okay, so perhaps a slight difference of opinion around the extent to which racism is perhaps conscious or unconscious, or perhaps it manifests itself in different ways if it's conscious racism or unconscious racism. But again, the point of Elizabeth's question, I think, is around how do you convince, particularly institutions, who say that as an institution we are not racist, but actually this is an issue that you as an institution need to address. And that's the question that I think Elizabeth was looking for some views on. Wally, is that something?
Yeah, can I just add? Yeah, so at the end of the day, the best way to show that to an organization is through data. So, I mean, most organizations, if not all, collect data on their staff. So, for example, at Wiltshire Council, we have an equality monitoring survey that we do every 2 years, I think. So look at the data. What does the data show us? So is the workforce, is the ethnic breakdown of the workforce representative of the wider community, the customers you serve, and so on. Also, not only that, but is that translating throughout the hierarchy of the organization? Because it's all very well having, a large number of ethnic minorities, but are they progressing? So looking at all of that will tell you whether there is a problem or not. And also something which is coming into force, hopefully, but some organizations are already doing it voluntarily, and that's the ethnic pay gap reporting. So obviously we have the gender pay gap reporting currently, but once the ethnic pay gap reporting comes in, if it does, then that will show us as well, whether there is a problem or not, and organizations will have to stand up and listen. And the other thing is stories. So there's a great quote I love from Brené Brown. She says that maybe stories are just data with a soul. So collect those stories. So one thing we did at Wiltshire Council recently is collect, positive and maybe slightly negative stories, but in anonymized form from, underrepresented groups, and we can present that to the senior management, and it will give them an insight as to how people are feeling, whether they're feeling positive or negative, included or excluded, and so on.
Thank you. Judy, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I was trying to address the issue by saying maybe not be too accusatory in the first place, that if you come at it in a way that doesn't immediately make them feel defensive, and gradually work your way towards looking at how they might be racist, then that's probably more likely to be effective.
Thank you. Belinda, is there anything to add?
No, I think both sort of Wally and Judy have spoken about what we have been addressing here. But I suppose going back to what Judy's saying is about if we challenge in a way that creates defensiveness, I don't think change will happen. So I think we do need to be able to have workplaces that are more like learning environments, so like learning organizations where conversations can start be happening without the fear of recourse, because if people are fearful of recourse, they retract, and so the issue becomes more hidden. And I would be liking the organizations start having much more open dialogue, and this is not just around race, this is about neurodiversity, it's about sort of people's sexuality, all those kind of areas that can have those unconscious bias. We need to be open to have these conversations and looking at workplaces where we really value diversity and we respect diversity and we understand the opportunity that diversity brings to a workforce. And there are some good examples. I work in local authorities, and there are some examples where focus groups are starting to happen, conversations are happening. As Wally said, I loved about that Brené Brown quote, narratives. The story is something that soul, that gives us, that story is the one that touches us. That story makes changes. If we are impacted to make change, it's because our heart is connecting to the issue and the problem. And I think there has to be a heart connection. I've actually seen Andy Howe somewhere on here. Andy once said, he said, we're not called to like people, we are called to love people. And we are called to love difference. And we're called to understand difference. And I remember that being so significant to me when I heard him say that. And it really challenged me is in life when I go into a situation where I'm working with somebody who's different and something hits me and I'm thinking, oh, I don't know how I'm going to manage that. Actually, I'm called to really, really understand myself to be able to work more effectively with somebody else. I need to change. I'm not expecting somebody else to change. I need to change my heart, or I need to change the way that I function. So I think open conversations are really important, but I'm coming from a very heart orientated, because that's who I am. So yeah, that's the social worker in me.
Thank you for that, Belinda. I think we could probably carry on discussing this for the rest of the night. It's a fascinating topic, and we've had some really engaging and challenging in some respects presentations. But I think we are coming towards the end of our time, so I think I'll need to call the Q&A to a close. Thank you all for that, and thank you everyone for your questions. And just pass it back to you, Alice, to conclude the event.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you very much. To all those who have attended today, on behalf of Community United, we would like to thank you for participating in this conversation. This is only the start of the conversation. We should not end this. I think we have a duty to go back and start the conversation and make changes, and please do that. Do use us, do come back to us with feedback. We will be also contacting you all with a survey, and also just look out for our next event. Thank you very, very much, and I hope you've enjoyed the event. Good night.